Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, Mr. Sergei Korsunsky. Mr. Korsunsky is the former ambassador of Ukraine to Japan. He is now a senior advisor at Nihon Cyber Defense and distinguished global scholar at Temple University's Japan campus. Well, Ambassador, and welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, Ambassador, always an honor to have you on our program. Now, let's get started. Again, recently you came out with this amazing article entitled A New European Security Architecture is Needed to End War in Ukraine. Lasting peace will require deterring future Russian aggression. Now, I want to get to the question right away. In the article, especially, we'll say, towards the middle portion of the writing, you mentioned there are several critical aspects or reasons are self-evident. And number one is no agreement with Putin's Russia can ever be trusted. Ambassador, let's start with a conversation at this a moment. What does that mean? Because we know that when President Trump, not only during his visit to the NATO summit, and also during his visit to the G7 summit, the topic of Ukraine was brought up many times, and also regarding the conversation with Vladimir Putin. But you pointed out that Putin Russia can never be trusted. What does that mean, and how do we understand the behavior of Putin at this moment?
The reason of this statement is very much simple and easy to understand. Once in 1991, Soviet Union ceased to exist, and three leaders of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine signed an agreement between them to dismantle this, as we all hoped, the last empire, and in a peaceful manner to establish our sovereignty, our borders, and relations between us. Ukraine was officially recognized not just by the whole world, by the Russia. It was the most important because long history of changing border between Ukraine and Russia, going back thousands of years, it was kind of a challenge to finally end all those discussions about who owns whom, who created whom, and to establish our newest state as sovereign, recognized, and independent nation. We have signed between Russia and Ukraine more than 300 bilateral agreements. All of them were ratified by both parliaments that made them part of the international law. Such an agreement, any agreement which are ratified by both parliaments, that means it does not depend who is in power, who is president, the person. It is important that the state recognize another state in this agreement. Always in the first clause of any such agreement, it says that both sides recognize each other borders, sovereignty, and independence. And all those agreements, whole package of more than 300 of them, were brutally violated. Let me tell you, so it was not just in 2022, it was 2014 when they began to annex Crimea and began to annexation of Donbass. So the story continues, it's a long story. And that means that through those actions, absolutely illegal against the international law, Russia violated all their words, all their promises. I'm not even mentioning here Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine abandoned third nuclear potential in the world in exchange of guarantees of security. And the signatories of this memorandum were Great Britain, United States, and Russia. And that is another brutal violation of international law.
Ambassador, in the article, that you emphasize something that we pay particularly attention. It's called the world order. And we know that today when we talk about the world order, it's no longer the same, especially when we look at the complication of the cases. And this is what you wrote, and I quote, While recognizing that profound changes in the global security architecture resulted from the worst aggression in Europe since World War II. Even Ukraine's supporters fail to see the difference with the wars of the past. And of course, that we always say when we look at the complication or intricacy of the war today, we cannot forget what happened in the past. But it's fascinating that you talk about this global security architecture. I think for us, fundamentally, Ambassador, what is the global security architecture at this moment? And why do you think today, when we look at the war in Ukraine, we look at Russia's aggression, this global security architecture ought to be reshaped or ought to be rebuilt up at this moment in order to prevent any dictatorship rise in the future? Your thoughts?
That's exactly what happened after the Second World War, when the United States and victorious allies, they decided to create a system of international organizations and international multilateral agreements which would keep Europe from any other war. That was a major point, was to keep Europe out of continuation of centuries of war between Germany, France, Italy, Britain, and so on. And first, we know now as NATO. Another mechanism which was established, that was United Nations Security Council, consisting of 5 victorious states, and that was the body entitled by the international community to decide all the issues about peace and war. And but the mistake which was made at this point, at that moment, that was veto power, which any member of these 5 countries possess until now. And that means that you cannot get an agreement between them right now on any issue. It doesn't matter that we talk about Ukraine, North Korea, or genocide in somewhere in Africa. They vote always like China and Russia against United States, Britain. So that is what's happening right now. So this security architecture was based as well on several very important agreements between the United States and Soviet Union in time of Reagan, Gorbachev, rapprochement on the start and limitation of number of troops in Europe and middle range missiles and so on and so forth. There were several conventions, multilateral conventions, for example, prohibition of nuclear weapons or landmines, and all of them, literally every one of them, expired and was not continued or was violated. So Russia now uses zillion of landmines. Russia now uses chemical weapons against Ukrainian army. All agreements about limitations on missiles and troops are no longer valid. So if you have all those agreements, if you don't have working nuclear United Nations Security Council, if you have no instrument to punish any aggressor in a very effective manner, what does it mean? That means there is no security architecture. If I'm powerful, if I have a nuclear weapon, I can assault anyone at my choice, and you can do nothing. That's exactly what I meant.
Ambassador, in the article, again, briefly, I just mentioned, we look at the past, and of course, there are so many lessons that we can draw, and also we need to understand. But one of the particular intricate war that people are still referring today is the Vietnam War. I mean, again, I was not born in that age, but I remember distinctly in school and also by speaking to the scholars that when we talk about the war in Vietnam, it was not only about the casualty, it was more about this political ideology. I mean, again, that could be biased opinion, but today, fast forward, when we look at the war in Ukraine, look at Russia's aggression towards, you mentioned Crimea, and also you mentioned Ukraine. How do you think, that I dare to ask the question, the similarities between the war, between the Vietnam War and also the war in Ukraine, when we talk about this political propaganda or this political ideology, how do you think that today, when we look at the war in Ukraine, we can actually learn a lot from the war of Vietnam. Your thoughts?
Uh, both cases, war in Korea and war in Vietnam, they were not about annexation of territories. United States never attempted to occupy Korea or occupy Vietnam and join this territory to the state of the United States. That is the principal difference. You can fight ideological war. You can fight the war on the side of, as it happened in Vietnam, and the side of civil war in a country where communists of the North were against regime in the South. So that was civil war. And then major powers, on one side it was China, and on the other side, and Soviet Union, on the other side it was United States and its allies. So that was the war based on ideology. War against Ukraine, this is classical colonial war, because Russia already included 4 regions of Ukraine or temporarily occupied into its constitution. So we are talking about physical gain, territorial gain in a war. This is number one. Number two, there were no civil war in Ukraine. There were no even slightest harm to the Russian interest in Ukraine. That was pure desire of Putin to export war on our territory to maintain his regime, because war is essence of the existence of the Russian state. Russia always at war or in the stage of preparation for the war. If you go back to centuries, you will see that I'm absolutely right. That is exactly what happens. And our hope that Soviet Union disappearance would lead to democratization of Russia failed completely. Even during the Yeltsin time, very brief 10 years of so-called democracy, behavior of Yeltsin in his decisions were very much colonial. He began war against his own province, Chechnya. That was first Chechen war. And Yeltsin lost this war. Putin won this war. They killed tens of thousands of their own citizens which wanted independence from Russia. So that is exactly the essence of this regime. That is why I'm absolutely convinced that we cannot hope that it could be resolved in any meaningful way as a normal negotiating process, because they already did it. I mean, even they do not have occupied those regions of Ukraine fully, but they already included them in their constitution. Think about this. This is absolutely insane.
Ambassador, again, I am so honored to have such a meaningful dialogue with you. Again, just based on your previous answer, that you pinpointed a lot of truth that we haven't realized, or perhaps that we need to realize as an international community. Now, let's keep our conversation going. Again, going back to what you point out in the article, I guess the simple question, how much do you believe that today the West can really understand Russia? Because you wrote, Western misconception of Russia are deeply rooted. I mean, if we listen to Donald Trump's rhetoric, especially when it comes to the relationship between Russia and US, or between Trump and Putin, it might sound ridiculous, but it seemed to be the fact that Trump still has faith in Putin, or Trump still trying to be a air quote good friend of Putin. But meanwhile, people are saying it's time to wake up. It's time to realize that you want to stand on the right side of the history, not on the wrong side. And also that every time we see President Zelensky and President Trump sit together, the conversation always be centered about the world peace and also this lasting security architecture, as you mentioned in the article, for the bigger picture. So today, why do you think that someone like Donald Trump, or why do you think people in the West are still not realizing or still don't understand this propaganda or this foolishness out of Russia towards the West?
You see, we have to return a little bit earlier than just President Trump. We have to return to era of George W.H. Bush and Clinton. I, as being Ukrainian, I can tell you, when in 1990 we have American President George W.H. Bush standing in the Ukrainian Parliament, and he was arguing to Ukrainian Parliament not to leave Soviet Union. We call it Chicken Kiev speech because that was exactly what it was all about. So our dream for more than 70 years to leave this communist empire, it was when we were listening to the leader of a free world who was saying, no, 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 you have to listen to Gorbachev and to stay inside. Why? Because the United States was afraid what will happen with nuclear weapons. We know what happened with nuclear weapons. So Ukraine, we continue our path to independence. But then we have Clinton, and Clinton completely misread Yeltsin and what happened in Russia. He hoped that Russia is able actually to transform itself into democratic nation, which would be based on rule of law, on elections and democratic political process. And he completely failed to see that Yeltsin was flesh from the communist regime. It was flesh from imperial mentality of Russia, which would go back to hundreds of years. So what happened then? It was Yeltsin who established Putin, and he requested support from Clinton, and he received his support. So they brought to power a KGB officer who was only on the surface like friendly to the West, but actually inside him, for him, the disappearance of Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 21st century. We celebrated, the whole world celebrated the disappearance of this communist prison, but for him, that was the biggest catastrophe. That's the answer. So only recently we see finally Europe and United States begin to realize what they're dealing with. They're dealing with a very deeply rooted culture of imperialistic mentality, the culture of Russian greatness based literally on nothing, because they cannot produce nothing meaningful except oil, gas, and weapons. So that is the core. You should understand that this nation will be always enemy to the West, because they cannot live like the West, but they want to live like the West. They want to enjoy Paris and Milan. They want to go to New York to go to the shopping on Fifth Avenue, but they have absolutely no idea how to produce anything which would be meaningful. Try yourself to name one product from Russia of high quality. That's the answer. Even then they insulted Ukraine. They suddenly realized that Ukraine, that they completely despised as a nation, live better than them. So that was the shock for them. That was the source of their hatred. That how come this small Ukraine, this is something which we do not even recognize, and they live better. So that is something you should understand. This is the character of the nation. This is the main internal structure. Even those whom we consider like opposition to Putin, even they are imperialists. That's the point. And the longer this simple truth is not recognized, the longer the West will be in trouble with Russia.
Ambassador, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about the critical concept of democracy. You mentioned that Russia openly challenges democracy, human rights, and broader liberal international order. Today, when we talk about democracy, again, as I mentioned, you and I, we had a previous discussions many times. Democracy, it's not just about the voting rights. Democracy, it's not just about the freedom of vote and freedom of expression, but democracy, it's something so tangible and it's something so personal to all of us. But today, when we look at North Korea, when we look at Iran, again, there are many other countries that you mentioned in the article. What is democracy today for Ukraine? Because again, I have to say that within the international community, regardless the G7, regardless the NATO members, people are hoping that this war could end soon, can restore democracy back to Ukraine. So for you, Ambassador, from your personal perspective, what is democracy for Ukraine at this moment? And again, based on my shallow understanding, it's not just about ending the war. There gotta be something much deeper to this, because the nation has suffered so long, not only about the Russian aggression, but many other aspects. So how can we have the full understanding of democracy at this moment?
That's definitely a complicated cocktail of different issues. One, when we talk about elections, just think about it. In Ukraine, we have 350 political parties. In Ukraine and presidential elections, we always have minimum 20-something candidates, and they are free to participate. No one limit their ability to participate in elections and present their program. And that is something which tells you a lot, right? So then you have in Ukraine, we conduct, it just happened when president, the leader of the country, would deviate from the policy the nation entitled him to conduct. We do revolutions. Twice it happens in 2004 and 2014. So people protest and they insist on certain issues which are important for nation. It's in Europe, and specifically in European Union. They were shocked to see in 2014 that the major people uprising against the policy of the current president at that time, Yanukovych, not to sign the agreement with the European Union. So that was the very ideological issue. We are Europe. We were in Europe always and mentally, and we want to be back to our home. And suddenly the president, which was promised and was entitled to do that, he suddenly says, no, I'm not going to sign it. And we know why, because Putin pushed him to do so. So you have people uprising. So people has right to protest peacefully. And it was always peacefully, if only the power did not use guns against this peaceful demonstration, and that's turned out to be deadly, and then we had revolution. So, but that is for us, it's very important. For Ukrainian society, for centuries, it survived on the horizontal connections between community, regions, and non-governmental institutions, I would say, because we are part of Russian Empire since 17th century. So survive all those years, centuries of being part of prosecuting empire, we had to develop our own culture of protest. And it was developed, and it is very effective. So Ukrainians will never tolerate anything imposed on them which is against the will of the people. So it is very clearly, very easy established through polling. I mean, you can ask people and they will tell you what they want, the majority. So the democracy for us means that if majority in a legal way decided something, all the nation should obey and follow the course. If you don't like it, you have right to protest, to present your case, to say something to correct the course, but you have no right not to do so, specifically if you're elected official. This is absolutely day and night compared to Russia. In Russia, you do not have political process, you do not have opposition, you do not have real elections, you have 26 years of the same president. How you can call this? Dictatorship, pure and simple.
Again, Ambassador, this is heartbreaking. I mean, again, this is indeed rather heartbreaking for all of us to understand how dictatorship could actually destroy democracy. Ambassador, I want to quickly wrap up our conversation and asking you the last question. As I mentioned before, the Spanish Prime Minister recently made a strong statement and to say that Spain is a peaceful nation, and also Spain fulfilled the deployment commitment. Spain always stands by Ukraine, and Spain fulfills the responsibility on NATO's eastern flank and also in the Mediterranean. Ambassador, the final question is how important it is continue for the NATO members and also the international community to stand shoulder to shoulder right next to Ukraine in order to save the world from being destroyed from dictators. Your final thoughts.
It's extremely important, and we are not talking right now about membership. We're talking about unification of democratic forces in Europe and clear understanding that only standing together we keep aggressive Russia at bay. This is exactly the point. I mean, before this war, NATO would say it's defensive alliance against like any enemy, against like theoretical threat. But now we see in Ankara, finally, we have a concentrated understanding that this enemy is Russia, this regime in Russia. It must go, it must be changed. The policy of Russia must be contained. Otherwise, we will see the war in Europe. And the statement you just mentioned from Spain, it's particularly important. It is true that Spain, being in the middle of the territory of NATO, it's like far away from the Russia and like safe and secure. But they understand the threat. If war in Europe will happen again, and if it will happen with participation of NATO territory, all members will be involved and will be terribly devastating. So we cannot afford that. We cannot afford war in Asia. We should restore peace and order, and that could be done only when democratic forces are united and strong.
Well, again, Ambassador, just to echo what you said in the article, that a lasting peace will indeed require deterring future of Russian aggression. Well, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Mr. Korsunsky. Again, Mr. Korsunsky is the former ambassador of Ukraine to Japan. He is now a senior advisor at Nihon Cyber Defense and a distinguished global scholar at Temple University's Japan campus. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing article. A new European security architecture is needed to end war in Ukraine. Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have it back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. Thank you so much for doing this.